Between the years 1921 to 1951, American Catholic priests and sisters labored in western Hunan, a remote province of central China. They were replacing Spanish Augustinian missionaries whose numbers had been depleted during World War I. All of them were meeting for the first time a proud and ancient people whose traditions had evolved over the centuries. The Americans belonged to three religious communities: the Passionists, with headquarters in Union City, New Jersey; the Sisters of Charity of St. Elizabeth from Convent Station, New Jersey; and the Sisters of St. Joseph from Baden, Pennsylvania. The area entrusted to the Passionists was vast, 15,400 miles, an isolated region equaling the combined states of Delaware, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island. The entire territory was mountainous, the scenery lovely, sometimes even grand. In the 1920s, the three main arteries of travel were rivers: the bandit-ridden Yuan, the Mayang, and the North, interrupted by swirling rapids, never without risk to cargo and crew. There were no roads, no rail traffic, and in the 1920s, the people were desperate for food, medical help, and schools. When the first American missionaries entered the region, Hunan's rice bowl was emptied by 2 years of crop failures. Hundreds of thousands of people were starving, and famine was followed by sickness and disease. Shocked by what they encountered, the newly arrived Americans begged funds from friends, family, and fellow Catholics in the United States. They called for nurses, teachers, and other helpers. Soon they had a network of relief stations, orphanages, schools, and dispensaries to help the people of Hunan. Though the missionaries had come with the message of faith, they found people starving for food and nourishment. In Yuanling, the city that was to become their headquarters, they saw the face of human misery.
Going out in twos in this city, we came on sights that were appalling. Scores of men, women, and children lay in the gutters, dead or dying. Outside the city west gate, we located a deep depression where abandoned babies were thrown and where wild dogs skulked. We had asked ourselves, what shall we do to establish the church in western Hunan? And the answer was clear in the words of Christ: I was hungry, and you gave me to eat.
Government relief stations where the starving received a bowl of watery soup were too few. Yet, every beggar who came to the mission station was given a bowl of rice. Within 3 years of their arrival, there were 4 churches and 26 chapels, 15 boys' schools, and 11 girls' schools. 2 orphanages, one for girls and the other for boys. Each central mission had a dispensary to which the Chinese flocked for help in their illnesses. In a population of about 5 million, there were only 2,000 Catholics.
He was professed as a Passionist in 1928. At that time, it was the period of real growth for our missions in China. In the period from 1921 until 28, there had been over 40 Passionists had gone to China. And therefore, I was inspired by the stories that they had shared with us. Education was one of the big challenges that we could help in educating these people. Another was we had been trained to do some clinical work in the clinics that were attached to our mission because the disease was so common amongst them. So during those first years in China, a great part of my time was not spent in catechizing, but in trying to care for the medical needs, especially of the children.
In an alien culture and in a land reeling from hunger and disease, the missionaries found it difficult to interest people of Hunan in the Christian gospel. The religions of the people were a blend of Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism. And these ancient traditions were firmly rooted. Deep social problems also faced the missionaries. In spite of the official attitude of the Chinese Republic, which frowned on polygamy, the problem was common. The keeping of concubines was lawful. Women were powerless to invoke the law in their defense. Hunan was the last of the provinces to admit foreigners to her borders. There were localities where a Caucasian had never been.
I'm a sister of charity of Convent Station, New Jersey. When we went to Hunan in 1933, we didn't have the hard experience of the pioneers who had gone there in 1925. However, famine was still raging, and there were sights and smells and sounds that appalled us because there was plenty of poverty, disease, and death. What also appalled us was the government. The province at that time was in the hands of warlords who coined their own money, raised their own armies, and did just about as they pleased. When we arrived there, our sisters were working with the pastors' fathers in Yuan. They were conducting a dispensary for the poor, a refuge for abandoned baby girls, and a catechumenate for the catechizing of women. We sisters reached out to the abandoned children of parents who were too poor to keep them. These children were usually the blind or the lame or the pockmarked one of the family. We did our best to educate them and to give them a sense of self-worth. And it really was a joy through the years to see these children develop into graceful young women.
My mother was a poor widow who had a sweet potato stall in Yuanling. My brother and I, little children at the time, both fell ill. A kind of skin ulcer covered me from head to foot, and a high fever tormented him. After my mother had spent nearly all her savings on doctors and medicines, she carried me to the nearby Catholic clinic, where American sisters gave free treatment to the poor. I still remember how Sister Finan took care of me that morning. First, she washed the affected parts of my body with a liquid medicine, and then she applied a yellow ointment. That same evening, accompanied by a Chinese sister, she visited us to see what she could do for my brother. It wasn't long before we both had recovered. Because of their charitable deed, my poor, illiterate mother began to realize that the so-called foreign devils were really good people. She liked to talk with them whenever she met them, and persuaded by Sister Marie-Therese Tuan, she eventually said goodbye to her sweet potato stall and accepted employment with the sisters. Sometime later, she became a Catholic, as did her 2 children.
The Catholic Church in Hunan grew slowly. Its life was in its schools and hospitals, its care for the sick and the poor. The American missionaries opened their hearts to the children, especially the orphans.
Shortly after my mother's death, my brother and several other orphans from Zhejiang were taken to Our Lady's Orphanage, supervised by Father Harold Travers in Baojing, about 120 kilometers northwest of Yuanling. In the workshops, we learned all kinds of trades such as barbering, carpentry, weaving, cooking, tailoring, making and mending shoes, printing, and so on. In running the orphanage, Father Harold taught self-reliance. What we wore from hat to shoes, what we used from exercise books to desks, were all made by ourselves. We were brothers, all living together, all loving and helping one another. And who took the place of our parents? Father Harold. He cared for our needs, our food, clothing, education, and recreation.
Our girls were very much in demand, so we knew that our method of training was right. They were in demand as marriage partners. We had a hard time keeping them past 18 years of age, and I became known as the mother of the brides. In time, about the time of the communist takeover, we had these girls. These girls were helping us. They were teaching in our schools. They were training in our hospitals. They were catechizing in our catechumenate.
Hunan could be a dangerous place. Isolated from the rest of China, Hunan was a center of bandit activity. Bandit armies carved up its territory, making travel dangerous and uncertain. In the 1920s and mid-1930s, the warlords responsible for these armies coined their own money and fought each other. Most tragic was the death in 1929 of 3 young Passionist missionaries who were trapped and killed in the hills south of Chengxi. As Fathers Clement Siebold, Walter Coviu, and Godfrey Holbein were returning by mule from their yearly retreat, bandits ordered them up a steep mountain. They were shot, and their bodies were later found lying in water in the bottom of the abandoned copper mine. In 1937, Japanese armies invaded China. Japanese planes bombed Hunan repeatedly. Refugees streamed through the towns and villages of Hunan, seeking safety from the Japanese, by bus, by foot, begging for food, lodging, and medicine. And great numbers of wounded Chinese soldiers, their uniforms in tatters, their bare feet blistered and bleeding. Some cities were reduced to a shambles. Many mission buildings were reduced to rubble. Yuanling was bombed 32 times. The sisters had lost their entire compound, convent, school, students' dormitory, chapel, dispensary, to Japanese bombs.
During the Japanese occupation of eastern China, over 1 million Chinese refugees left their homes in eastern China to avoid being subject to the Japanese domination. And these people, when they reached western Hunan, were in very dire circumstances. They had, on their long travels, some of them 600 and 800 miles, they had used up whatever resources they might have, whatever wealth they were able to bring with them. So when they reached western Hunan, they were very much at the mercy of anyone who might exploit them, and many of them did not have enough to eat. So under the American Red Cross at that time, the missions in many parts of Western China began to set up refugee camps for these people. We had many converts amongst these people.
At the end of World War II, as the nationalist armies were exhausted from 8 years of fighting the Japanese, the communists made their bid for power. China's economy was shattered, and the people were desperate for a new order. Communist armies had invaded Western Hunan in 1927, again in 1935. Periodically, groups of communist propagandists sought to infiltrate the mission schools and clinics and turn the local population against the foreigners. Finally, in October of 1949, Hunan was under communist control. By 1950, at the outbreak of the Korean War, all mission work had to stop. Communist troops occupied the mission compounds. By the end of the year, they were stabling their horses in the church. Mao Zedong, the wily communist leader, a native of Hunan, preached a doctrine of self-reliance. No outsiders need to help us. The foreigner had to go, but Mao had a special animosity for Americans. American imperialism is far more dangerous than Japanese imperialism. The American missionaries had to be discredited, then banished from China.
But we were finally given our exit visas in March 1951. We were told we had 6 days in which to get out of UN Ling. And we were also told to report every day to the local security office. The first day that we went, the priests were also ordered to appear with us. So there was quite a crowd of us that went up to the local office. It was a snowy day, the streets were slushy, and we were made to stand outside the office in the snow. This was the main street, and across the road were all these open-fronted Oriental shops, which were crowded with curious people, very silent, watching us to see what would happen. This went on for about 15 minutes, us standing in the snow, the people across the street just looking at us. When a little old lady from the country came in, almost bent in double under her load of twigs that she brought to the city to sell. She looked around, saw the priest and sister standing there, shrugged off her burden, and went to the bishop and knelt down in the snow and said to the bishop, "Please, Bishop, give me a blessing." While the bishop was blessing her, the Christians in the crowds across the way all rushed forward, and in a very short time, there were people kneeling in front of every priest, asking for his blessing. In the snow, wet road, slush. One of the sentries must have gone in to notify Nero. That's the nickname we gave to the communist bigwig in our area. And he came blustering out, cursing, kicked the old woman's bundle so that the twigs all fell apart, then looked at us and ordered us inside. We continued to report to Social Security every day for the next 5 days. But the priests were no longer ordered to go with us, and we were allowed inside as soon as we arrived.
I remember the day that I was arrested and taken through the street with my hands tied behind my back. Some of the people whom I knew, they were not Catholics, but they were friends of mine because they had been in this town for 6 or 7 years. So some of them began to cry because they thought I was being taken out to be executed. But here it's almost 40 years later, and I'm still existing. I haven't died yet.
Then they tied me up, my hands behind my back and my elbows together, and they put a noose around my neck, and they took me out on the street of the town of Yuanling. They called the entire town to be present, to curse this American imperialist. And the one consolation was nobody cursed the priest. And then to cause more disturbance, they would pull on the noose, and you would stumble and stagger, and then they would call the people to laugh at this American fool. Nobody laughed. That was a great consolation.
During a period of 30 years, 80 American Passionists labored in Hunan. 10 lie buried there, and some few returned to the United States broken in health. 20 Sisters of Charity, 3 of them Chinese, were part of the mission, and have left behind them 6 graves. The Sisters of St. Joseph, 1 grave. After the Americans left, a great cloak of silence fell over Hunan and most of China. Those most closely associated with the Americans suffered the most.
Not long after his ordination, Father John Nian, a Chinese priest, was sent by the bishop to visit the Christians in the countryside. On his way, he was arrested, charged with seeing the Christians without permission. First, he was imprisoned. Then, freedom was promised if he would testify against Bishop Cuthbert O'Gara or the Pope. Having refused to comply, Father Nian was exiled to Chundaping, an area about 75 kilometers north of Yuanling. The villagers there were warned that he was a very dangerous and stubborn enemy of the new China, that everyone should keep watch and show him no pity. Father John Nian then became a beggar, and during the famine of 1960, he starved and frozen to death. My brother Joseph told me that during the Cultural Revolution, he was sent to Chundaping, where he lodged with a poor old peasant. Privately, he informed my brother that he had buried a beggar named Nian some years before, and he added, "It was very strange that when I was burying his body, I smelled some sweet fragrance, though it was winter time, no flowers at all."
Sister Anna Sumter Lay was a native Hunanese girl who joined our community and made her first profession in December 1949. When we were expelled, we tried to get an exit visa for her too, but the Chinese authorities refused, and she was jailed for 14 months. She was tortured and treated very harshly. And at the end of that time, they released her, and they said to her, "We'll never be able to put anything into that marble dome of yours." She went directly to Yuanling. She reached there in October of 1952. She sought out Father Rayfield. She fell on her knees before him, asked for his blessing. She earned her own living as a sewer, and then she was picked up again. This time she was put in a labor camp just outside Yuanling. In her last 8 years there, altogether, she spent about 30 years in and out of communist prisons. And during her last 8 years there, the people noticed that her health was declining. They said that her abdomen was distended and that she stumbled along on badly swollen feet. Finally, they reported that she was taken out of the fields and she was put sewing uniforms for Chinese soldiers. During this period, she became very well known to the people of that area, the people in the prison and out. She died in May 1961.
Some of the Christians of the Yuanling diocese were imprisoned for long periods of time, even from 20 to 30 years. And many had relatives who had been maimed and who had died as the result of torture. Still, they remember and practice what in happier days had been taught them.
I know by personal experience what took place in the Yuanling Diocese of Hunan, my native province, in the 1920s, when the first American Passionist missionaries arrived in Yuanling. They risked their lives, but continued to come, group after group. Shortly afterwards, some American Sisters of Charity and Sisters of St. Joseph joined in their apostolate. In spite of the difficulties of traveling, a very strange language, quite different food, rough living conditions, and loneliness, they worked hard for God's glory. In harmony with their Chinese friends, they shared their joys and sorrows. Some of the bodies of these missionaries lie buried in Chinese ground. When they were forced out of China by the communist government in 1951, these so-called imperialist invaders and aggressors left Western Hunan its best and the biggest hospital, the only nursing school in that area, several well-equipped dispensaries, a girls' high school, 7 elementary schools, a girls' orphanage, a boys' orphanage, 2 cathedrals, some churches and chapels. But they also left behind their 3,000 Chinese Catholic friends and local non-Catholic people excellent examples of peacefulness, goodness, kindness, selflessness, generosity, hospitality, and charity.